In this video, we'll look through some of the example artists and tie in some of the design vocabulary words for week 3. The first artist we'll talk about is Alexandra Drenth, and she's making these really interesting textile works using embroidery. Now, it might seem strange to you to look at something like this in a digital media class, but believe it or not, the idea of pixels and the idea of computer graphics programming actually comes from weaving and textiles. I don't have time to get into that history right now, but ask me about it sometime and I'll tell you. So in this work, we have rhythm and repetition. Rhythm is the result of repetition between positive spaces separated by negative spaces. In this work, we can see progressive rhythm, where a motif or an element changes each time it's repeated. So I see that here in this column of figures and the detail on the right. Looks like we have variations on a silhouette with antlers filled in with different patterns. In the next slide, we'll see some great examples of flowing rhythm, which is created by a repetition of forms along wavy lines. And that really stands out in these red and white radial shapes that kind of flow in arcs over the tapestry. Next, we'll look at Julie Speed for great examples of image hierarchy. That's this idea of arranging elements in an image to show their order of importance. So we can see some examples of that here in the color, where saturated colors typically attract more attention than muted ones. This red background, it's very saturated. It's not mixed with black or white. Even though it's in the background, it still commands a lot of attention to the overall image. We could also talk about alignment, where out-of-alignment elements stand out over aligned ones. The human figures here are out of alignment with the triangles. That's part of what draws attention to them. We also have proximity, where closely placed elements seem related. These humanistic sections are out of alignment with the triangles, but they're close enough to where they give us an implied relationship. More examples of rhythm here. These are 2 collages from a series of 3. You can see the identical backgrounds. Each background on its own has a random rhythm, where there's repetition in no apparent order with no regular spaces. But since that random background is repeated twice in the series, we also have a regular rhythm where there are repeating identical elements spaced evenly. Next we have Desiree De Leon, whose very funny, very whimsical collages give us an example of transformation, which is to clearly alter the form or appearance of something, like these corn chips that she's turned into mountains. We have hierarchy again in terms of texture, where more varied textures stand out over less varied ones. It's partially the texture that makes this central part of the image most important. Also, negative space, where more space around elements draws the eye toward them. Even taking the drawing parts into account, there's very little positive space aside from the food items in this image. Between that and the texture, we're really just drawn right there into the central part of the image. Similar things happening in these images. We could also think back to some earlier vocab terms like contrast and juxtaposition. Next up, Jason Sullivan, whose images are made in the form of mandalas, where we have lots of these radial patterns repeating over and over in an orderly fashion. And so we have transformation. Again, that's where we're altering the form or appearance of something, changing the nature or the function or the condition. So we're taking these images of cars, which are normally something you'd find in advertising, and transforming them into a mandala image, which is something much more aligned with spirituality and religion. We also have transformation in technical Photoshop terms, where we're scaling and rotating and distorting digital images. And we have image hierarchy in terms of repetition, where repeating styles can suggest relationships between different parts of an image. And just looking at this again, you can see how much cohesion there is given how much repetition it has. Okay, so those are just a few touch points for some of this week's example artists and design vocabulary. Please take time and make sure you read through all of the vocab terms and take a look at the additional artists that we didn't get a chance to talk about. I promise they are all very interesting and inspiring examples for your work this week.